World War II did not start with Hitler. It started with a signature placed on a treaty in 1919, a treaty designed to secure peace. Instead, it created revenge. And revenge, when mixed with economic collapse and political instability, does not disappear. It waits. In 1913, Europe believed it was at the height of civilization. Railways crisscrossed the continent. Telegraph wires carried messages in minutes instead of weeks. Industrial factories roared day and night, producing steel, textiles, weapons, machinery. Cities like London, Berlin, Paris, and Vienna were centers of culture, science, philosophy, and finance. The global economy was deeply interconnected. Trade flowed across oceans. Empires governed territories on multiple continents. The world seemed modern, organized, and stable. At the center of this system stood Europe's great powers. The British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface. Its navy dominated global trade routes. Its colonies stretched from India to Africa to the Caribbean. Britain was the financial heart of the world. The German Empire, unified only in 1871, had rapidly transformed into an industrial giant. Its factories rivaled Britain's. Its scientific advancements were admired. Its military was disciplined, modern, and formidable. Germany was ambitious, confident, and increasingly assertive. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was older and more fragile. It governed a patchwork of ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, and others, each with their own languages and national aspirations. The empire held together, but only barely. To the east, the Russian Empire stretched across vast territories. It possessed enormous manpower, but internally it struggled with poverty, political repression, and social unrest. On the surface, Europe looked powerful. Underneath, it was tense. Nationalism was spreading rapidly. Smaller ethnic groups wanted independence. Citizens increasingly defined themselves by nation and language rather than empire. At the same time, militarism was rising. Governments invested heavily in armies and navies. Military service became a symbol of patriotism. Newspapers glorified strength. Generals drafted detailed war plans that could be activated at a moment's notice. Then there was the alliance system. Europe had divided itself into two heavily armed blocs. On one side, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the Triple Alliance. On the other, Britain, France, and Russia, the Triple Entente. These alliances were meant to deter war. Instead, they made any conflict far more dangerous. If one nation fought, others would be pulled in automatically. It was a delicate balance. Too delicate. By 1914, Europe was not peaceful. It was waiting. And when systems are built on tension, they do not need much to collapse. They only need a trigger. What most Europeans did not realize in 1913 was that their world, their stable, prosperous, interconnected world, was standing on the edge of a cliff. And once it fell, it would never be the same again. The war that followed would not only destroy empires, it would destroy the illusion of permanent stability. And in the ruins of that illusion, something far more dangerous would grow. On June 28, 1914, Sarajevo woke up to what seemed like an ordinary summer morning. The city, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had long been a crossroads of cultures and tensions. Nationalist movements were growing throughout the Balkans, especially among Slavic populations who resented imperial control. That day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting the city to observe military exercises. To Vienna, it was a routine political appearance. To Serbian nationalists, it was a symbol of foreign domination. A small group of young conspirators positioned themselves along the Archduke's motorcade route. They were inexperienced, radicalized, and determined to send a message. The first attempt failed. A bomb was thrown but missed its target, exploding behind the Archduke's car and injuring others. The motorcade sped away. It could have ended there, but history rarely moves in straight lines. Later that day, after a series of confusion and wrong turns, the Archduke's car stopped unexpectedly near a cafe. By coincidence, one of the conspirators, Gavrilo Princip, was standing nearby. He stepped forward. He fired 2 shots. The Archduke was mortally wounded. So was his wife, Sophie. Within hours, both were dead. At first, Europe did not erupt into chaos. Political assassinations were not uncommon in the early 20th century. Many assumed this would remain a regional dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. But Europe in 1914 was not governed by isolated events. It was governed by alliances. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and prepared to retaliate, backed firmly by Germany, which offered unconditional support. Vienna issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. The demands were intentionally severe. Serbia accepted most of them, but not all. That was enough. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and then the alliance system activated like a chain reaction. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France mobilized in support of Russia. Germany invaded Belgium as part of its pre-planned military strategy. Britain declared war when Belgium's neutrality was violated. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in war. What had begun as a localized political assassination had triggered a global conflict. But the assassination itself was not the true cause. It was a spark. The real cause lay in years of rising nationalism, militarism, imperial competition, and rigid alliances that made de-escalation nearly impossible. European leaders believed mobilizing quickly would protect their nations. Instead, it eliminated their ability to step back. Crowds cheered as soldiers marched to the front, convinced the war would be short and victorious. They expected glory. They expected triumph. They did not expect trenches, machine guns, chemical weapons, and years of stalemate. The shot in Sarajevo did not create the tensions in Europe. It exposed them. And once those tensions ignited, the fire could not be contained. What followed would devastate an entire generation. And when the war finally ended in 1918, the peace that followed would prove just as dangerous as the war itself. When the war began in the summer of 1914, most soldiers believed they would be home by Christmas. They imagined swift offenses, decisive battles, and heroic charges. Instead, they found mud, barbed wire, and a new kind of warfare the world had never seen before. The opening months of the conflict shattered illusions quickly. Germany's invasion of France was halted at the Battle of the Marne. Both sides dug in. Defensive lines stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. And then the war stopped moving. Trench warfare defined the Western Front. Soldiers lived in narrow, muddy corridors carved into the earth. Water pooled at their feet. Rats fed on corpses. Disease spread easily. The smell of decay never disappeared. Between the opposing trench systems lay no man's land. A devastated strip of land littered with craters, shattered trees, and bodies. To advance meant climbing out a trench and running directly into machine gun fire. Industrialization had transformed warfare. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery barges lasted for hours, sometimes days. Before infantry were ordered forward, entire regiments could be wiped out in minutes. At battles like Verdun and Somme, casualties reached into the hundreds of thousands, yet territorial gains were measured in meters. For the first time in history, technology had outpaced strategy. Armies were still thinking in terms of 19th century maneuvers, but they were fighting in a 20th century industrial slaughterhouse. And the war expanded beyond the Western Front. In the East, massive armies clashed across vast territories. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire fought to survive. At sea, submarines targeted merchant vessels, threatening global trade. And in 1915, a new horror was introduced: chemical warfare. Poison gas drifted across trenches, burning lungs and blinding soldiers. Gas masks became essential equipment. Even with protection, fear of gas attacks haunted the battlefield. The war also transformed entire societies. Factories shifted to military production. Women entered industrial workforces in unprecedented numbers. Food shortages became common as blockades strangled supply lines. Civilian populations suffered alongside soldiers. By 1917, exhaustion was everywhere. Russia collapsed into revolution. The Russian Empire fell, replaced by a new Bolshevik government that withdrew from the war. The United States entered the conflict, tipping the balance. Germany, blockaded and starving, faced internal unrest. By 1918, the German offensive failed. Allied forces pushed forward. And on November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed. The fighting stopped, but nothing else felt resolved. More than 16 million people were dead, for empires had collapsed. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire. Entire regions were politically unstable. New nations were created overnight, often with fragile borders and unresolved ethnic tensions. Europe had not simply won or lost a war. It had been traumatized. The war destroyed faith in monarchies. It discredited old political systems. It normalized mass death on an industrial scale. And it left millions of veterans returning home to unemployment, injury, and psychological scars. The generation that survived carried anger. And anger does not vanish when guns fall silent. It waits for direction. The First World War did not merely change borders. It changed expectations. It proved that modern nations could mobilize entire populations for a total war. It proved that industrial capacity could determine survival. And it proved that peace imposed without reconciliation could be unstable. When the war ended in 1918, Europe was exhausted, but not healed. And in that fragile moment, decisions would be made that shaped the next catastrophe. Because the battlefield destruction was only the beginning, the real consequences would unfold at the peace table. When the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, Europe was exhausted. But exhaustion is not the same as reconciliation. The First World War had destroyed armies, economies, and empires. Millions were dead. Entire regions were destabilized. Monarchies had collapsed. Revolutions were spreading. The question facing victorious powers was simple and dangerous. How do you prevent this from ever happening again? In 1919, leaders from the Allied nations gathered in Paris to design a new world order. Among them were the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French leader Georges Clemenceau, and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Each arrived with different priorities. France had suffered deeply. Much of the fighting had taken place on French soil. Entire towns were flattened. Generations of young men were gone. France wanted security and punishment. Britain wanted balance. It sought to weaken Germany, but not destroy it entirely. The United States promoted a vision of self-determination and international cooperation, embodied in Wilson's 14 points. But compromise proved difficult, and fear often outweighed idealism. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. On paper, it was meant to secure lasting peace. In reality, it reshaped Europe in ways that would destabilize it for decades. Germany was excluded from negotiations. It was not invited to discuss terms. It was summoned to accept them. One clause in particular would become infamous, Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. It assigned full responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies. This was more than a legal technicality. It was a moral declaration. Germany was officially labeled the aggressor. The consequences were severe. Germany lost significant territory in Europe. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Other regions were handed to newly formed states like Poland. Overseas colonies were stripped away. The German military was drastically restricted. The army was limited in size. Tanks were banned. The navy was reduced. The air force was eliminated entirely. And perhaps most devastating of all, Germany was required to pay massive reparations to the Allied powers. The exact amount was staggering. To many Germans, this did not feel like peace. It felt like humiliation. The German delegation that signed the treaty did so under protest. Many within Germany believed their nation had not truly been defeated militarily. The fighting had ended with German troops still outside their own borders. This perception gave rise to a powerful narrative, the stab-in-the-back myth. According to this belief, Germany had not lost a war on the battlefield. It had been betrayed internally by politicians, socialists, and minorities who signed an unjust peace. Whether accurate or not, the myth spread quickly, and humiliation has consequences. The economic burden placed on Germany proved overwhelming. Reparations strained the fragile post-war government, the Weimar Republic, which had replaced the old imperial system. In the early 1920s, Germany experienced hyperinflation. so extreme that money lost value almost overnight. Workers were paid twice a day because wages lost value within hours. Savings evaporated. Middle-class families who had once lived comfortably found themselves ruined. Economic pain erodes faith in democracy, and political instability follows economic collapse. Meanwhile, new nations formed from the wreckage of empires were fragile and unstable. Borders drawn at Versailles often ignored ethnic realities. Minority populations found themselves trapped in unfamiliar states. Eastern Europe became a patchwork of unresolved tensions. The treaty was not merely punitive. It was fragile. It satisfied no one fully. France feared Germany might recover. Germany felt unjustly punished. The United States eventually retreated into isolation, and the League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, lacked enforcement power. The peace that followed World War I was built on imbalance. It reduced Germany's military power, but did not eliminate its industrial capacity. It imposed penalties without ensuring reconciliation. It redrew maps without resolving deep ethnic rivalries. And most importantly, it left millions of Germans feeling humiliated, angry, and betrayed. The treaty did not guarantee another war, but it created conditions in which another war could grow. Resentment is rarely visible at first. It builds quietly. It hardens over time. And when economic crisis strikes, when leadership falters, resentment seeks direction. By 1919, the First World War was over, but the emotional and political aftermath had only just begun. The battlefield had ended. The instability had not. And in that instability, a new political force was preparing to rise. By the mid-1920s, Germany appeared to be stabilizing. The worst of the hyperinflation had passed. International loans, especially from the United States, helped prop up the fragile German economy. Industries slowly recovered. Berlin became a center of culture, art, and experimentation. On the surface, it seemed that the wounds of World War I were beginning to heal, but the stability was fragile. It depended heavily on foreign credit, and it depended on a global economic system that was far less stable than it appeared. In October 1929, the illusion shattered. The American stock market collapsed. What began as a financial crisis in the United States quickly rippled across the globe. Banks failed. Loans were called in. Credit vanished almost overnight. Germany was hit particularly hard because much of its recovery had been financed by American loans. When U.S. banks demanded repayment, the German economy began to suffocate. Factories closed. Unemployment surged. By the early 1930s, millions of Germans were without work. Families lost homes. Savings disappeared. Lines formed outside soup kitchens. The middle class, already traumatized by hyperinflation just a few years earlier, felt betrayed once again. Economic collapse does more than create poverty. It destroys confidence. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government, struggled to respond. Political coalitions fractured. Emergency decrees became common. Parliamentary gridlock made decisive action nearly impossible. To many citizens, democracy appeared weak, ineffective, chaotic, and when people feel powerless, they look for certainty. They look for strength. They look for someone who claims to have simple answers. Across Germany, extremist political movements gained momentum. Communist parties promised revolution. Nationalist groups promised restoration. Street clashes between rival factions became common. Violence entered everyday politics. The memory of the Treaty of Versailles remained vivid. Reparations were still resented. Territorial losses were still painful. The war guilt clause still burned. The economic crisis did not create anger. It amplified it. And in this environment, one political movement proved particularly effective at channeling that anger: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was not initially a major political figure. In the early 1920s, his movement was fringe, but he understood something critical. Economic pain creates emotional vulnerability. He spoke of betrayal. He spoke of humiliation. He blamed the Treaty of Versailles. He blamed political elites. He promised to restore pride. He promised to rebuild the military. He promised jobs, unity, strength. His speeches were theatrical, emotional, and direct. He did not offer complicated policy solutions. He offered clarity. And clarity is powerful in times of chaos. As unemployment climbed and political instability deepened, support for his party grew rapidly. By 1932, Germany was in political paralysis. No party could secure a stable majority. Violence between extremist groups escalated. Many conservative leaders believed they could control Hitler by bringing him into government. In January 1933, he was appointed chancellor. They believed they were managing him. They were wrong. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly. Political opponents were suppressed. Civil liberties were suspended. Power was centralized. Within months, Germany was no longer a fragile democracy. It was becoming a dictatorship. And the very grievances born from World War I, humiliation, resentment, economic suffering, were now being mobilized into aggressive nationalism. The Treaty of Versailles had weakened Germany militarily. The Great Depression had destabilized it politically. Together, they created the perfect conditions for radical transformation. By the early 1930s, the fragile peace established in 1919 was unraveling. International cooperation weakened. Economic nationalism increased. Trust between nations declined. The League of Nations proved ineffective at enforcing agreements. And while many European leaders hoped to avoid another catastrophic war, they underestimated how quickly resentment could turn into action. The First World War had ended the old order. The Treaty of Versailles had attempted to reshape it. The Great Depression shattered what remained of stability. And in the ruins of that stability, a new and far more dangerous conflict was taking form. World War II did not begin with tanks crossing borders. It began with economic collapse, with political paralysis, with leaders promising redemption through strength. By the time Europe recognized the pattern, the transformation was already complete, and the next war would not be a repeat of the first. It would be larger, faster, and far more destructive. By the mid-1920s, Germany appeared to be stabilizing. The worst of the hyperinflation had passed. International loans, especially from the United States, helped prop up the fragile German economy. Industries slowly recovered. Berlin became a center of culture, art, and experimentation. On the surface, it seemed that the wounds of World War I were beginning to heal, but the stability was fragile. It depended heavily on foreign credit, and it depended on a global economic system that was far less stable than it appeared. In October 1929, the illusion shattered. The American stock market collapsed. What began as a financial crisis in the United States quickly rippled across the globe. Banks failed. Loans were called in. Credit vanished almost overnight. Germany was hit particularly hard because much of its recovery had been financed by American loans. When U.S. banks demanded repayment, the German economy began to suffocate. Factories closed. Unemployment surged. By the early 1930s, millions of Germans were without work. Families lost homes. Savings disappeared. Lines formed outside soup kitchens. The middle class, already traumatized by hyperinflation just a few years earlier, felt betrayed once again. Economic collapse does more than create poverty. It destroys confidence. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government, struggled to respond. Political coalitions fractured. Emergency decrees became common. Parliamentary gridlock made decisive action nearly impossible. To many citizens, democracy appeared weak, ineffective, chaotic, and when people feel powerless, they look for certainty. They look for strength. They look for someone who claims to have simple answers. Across Germany, extremist political movements gained momentum. Communist parties promised revolution. Nationalist groups promised restoration. Street clashes between rival factions became common. Violence entered everyday politics. The memory of the Treaty of Versailles remained vivid. Reparations were still resented. Territorial losses were still painful. The war guilt clause still burned. The economic crisis did not create anger. It amplified it. And in this environment, one political movement proved particularly effective at channeling that anger. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was not initially a major political figure. In the early 1920s, his movement was fringe, but he understood something critical. Economic pain creates emotional vulnerability. He spoke of betrayal. He spoke of humiliation. He blamed the Treaty of Versailles. He blamed political elites. He promised to restore pride. He promised to rebuild the military. He promised jobs, unity, strength. His speeches were theatrical, emotional, and direct. He did not offer complicated policy solutions. He offered clarity. And clarity is powerful in times of chaos. As unemployment climbed and political instability deepened, support for his party grew rapidly. By 1932, Germany was in political paralysis. No party could secure a stable majority. Violence between extremist groups escalated. Many conservative leaders believed they could control Hitler by bringing him into government. In January 1933, he was appointed chancellor. They believed they were managing him. They were wrong. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly. Political opponents were suppressed. Civil liberties were suspended. Power was centralized. Within months, Germany was no longer a fragile democracy. It was becoming a dictatorship. And the very grievances born from World War I, humiliation, resentment, economic suffering, were now being mobilized into aggressive nationalism. The Treaty of Versailles had weakened Germany militarily. The Great Depression had destabilized it politically. Together, they created the perfect conditions for a radical transformation. By the early 1930s, the fragile peace established in 1919 was unraveling. International cooperation weakened. Economic nationalism increased. Trust between nations declined. The League of Nations proved ineffective at enforcing agreements. And while many European leaders hoped to avoid another catastrophic war, they underestimated how quickly resentment could turn into action. The First World War had ended the old order. The Treaty of Versailles had attempted to reshape it. The Great Depression shattered what remained of stability. And in the ruins of that stability, a new and far more dangerous conflict was taking form. World War II did not begin with tanks crossing borders. It began with economic collapse, with political paralysis, with leaders promising redemption through strength. By the time Europe recognized the pattern, the transformation was already complete, and the next war would not be a repeat of the first. It would be larger, faster, and far more destructive. By the time Adolf Hitler consolidated power in 1933, Germany was no longer merely recovering from crisis. It was transforming. The Treaty of Versailles had placed strict military limitations on Germany. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. Tanks were forbidden. The Air Force did not exist. The Navy was severely restricted. But Hitler had no intention of honoring those restrictions. Almost immediately, Germany began rearming in secret. Factories that had once struggled during Depression now reopened, this time producing weapons. Military service was reintroduced. Aircraft production expanded rapidly. Research into armored warfare accelerated. The rearmament program did more than rebuild the military. It reduced unemployment. It restored national confidence. It made Hitler appear effective. In 1936, Germany took a bold step. It remilitarized the Rhineland, a region that, under Versailles, had to remain demilitarized. The move was a direct violation of the treaty. French and British leaders were alarmed, but they hesitated. France was politically divided and wary of acting alone. Britain, still traumatized by the First World War, favored negotiation over confrontation. No military response came. For Hitler, this was a revelation. The international system that had punished Germany in 1919 now appeared unwilling to enforce its own rules. The risk had been small. The reward was enormous. German troops marched into the Rhineland to cheering crowds. The gamble had paid off. In 1938, Hitler turned toward Austria. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, brought the country into German right without significant resistance. Many Austrians welcomed the Union. Again, Britain and France protested diplomatically, but took no military action. The pattern was becoming clear. Bold moves, minimal consequences. The next target was Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a region with a significant ethnic German population. Hitler claimed he sought only to protect German minorities. European leaders, desperate to avoid another war, met in Munich in 1938. There, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French leaders agreed to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland, believing it would satisfy Hitler's ambitions. The Munich Agreement was hailed by some as a triumph of diplomacy. Chamberlain returned to Britain declaring he secured peace for our time, but peace built on concession is fragile. Within months, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, territory it had not even claimed during negotiations. The illusion that Hitler's ambitions were limited was shattered. Yet still, the memory of World War I haunted European leaders. The scale of that destruction made them reluctant to act decisively. They feared another trench war. They feared another generation lost. Hitler understood this fear, and he used it. In August 1939, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it promised neutrality between the two powers. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The diplomatic landscape shifted overnight. Germany no longer feared a two-front war. The path to invasion was clear. On September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, replaced the static trench warfare of World War I. Tanks moved rapidly. Aircraft struck infrastructure and military targets simultaneously. The strategy was swift and coordinated. Britain and France had guaranteed Polish independence. 2 days later, they declared war on Germany. World War II had begun, but this war did not emerge from nowhere. It was not a sudden eruption of madness. It was a consequence of unresolved tension from the First World War, the humiliation imposed at Versailles, the economic devastation of the Great Depression, the failure of democratic institutions in times of crisis, the unwillingness of European powers to confront early violations, each step built upon the last. World War I had shattered the old European order. The Treaty of Versailles attempted to reconstruct it. Unevenly and punitively, the Great Depression destabilized fragile governments. Hitler exploited that instability and rebuilt Germany's military strength. Appeasement emboldened expansion, and when the invasion of Poland finally came, it was not a surprise. It was a culmination of 20 years of accumulating pressure. The Second World War was not simply another conflict. It was the unfinished chapter of the first. In 1918, leaders believed they had ended the greatest war in history. In reality, they had paused it. The First World War had destroyed empires. The second would destroy illusions, and together, they would reshape the 20th century. When people look back at the 20th century, they often see two world wars, two separate conflicts, two separate catastrophes. But history is rarely that clean. The Second World War did not emerge from a vacuum in 1939. It grew out of the unresolved consequences of 1918. The First World War shattered Europe's political foundations. It destroyed empires that had stood for centuries. The German Empire collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fragmented. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated. The Russian Empire fell into revolution. But the peace that followed did not rebuild stability on equal ground. It punished. It humiliated. It redrew borders without fully resolving ethnic tensions. It weakened one nation while leaving it economically vital. And it assumed that resentment could be contained by paper agreements. The Treaty of Versailles was not the sole cause of the Second World War, but it created an atmosphere of grievance, an emotional wound inside Germany. That wound deepened during hyperinflation. It widened during the Great Depression, and it became politically weaponized under Adolf Hitler. At the same time, Europe's democratic powers were exhausted. The memory of trench warfare haunted leaders in London and Paris. The destruction of Verdun, and the Somme was still fresh in the minds of millions. Fear of another mass slaughter shaped foreign policy. Appeasement was not born from weakness alone. It was born from trauma. But trauma can distort judgment. Each time Hitler violated the Treaty of Versailles, he tested the system. Each time Europe hesitated, he pushed further. The Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia. Each step was a calculation. Each success reinforced the belief that the post-World War I order lacked enforcement. By 1939, the fragile structure created in 1919 had collapsed entirely. The invasion of Poland was not simply aggression. It was the breaking point of 2 decades of accumulated instability. The First World War ended empires. The Second World War ended illusions. Together, they reshaped global power permanently. After 1945, Europe would never again dominate the world as it once had. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. The global order shifted. Colonial empires began to dissolve. International institutions were rebuilt with stronger enforcement mechanisms. Leaders understood something that had been missed in 1919. Punishment alone does not create lasting peace. Stability requires economic recovery, reconciliation, balance, and credible enforcement. The tragedy of the early 20th century was not only that 2 world wars occurred, it was that the First War created conditions that made the second possible. The war to end all wars did not end war. It transformed it. It demonstrated how fragile interconnected systems can become when pride, punishment, economic collapse, and political extremism converge. History does not move in isolated chapters. It moves in chains of cause and effect. 1914 led to 1918. 1918 led to 1919. 1919 led to economic fragility. Economic fragility led to radicalization. Radicalization led to 1939. And 1939 changed the world forever. World War II was not an accident of one man's ambition alone. It was a result of unresolved tension left behind by World War I. 2 wars, 1 continuous crisis, and a lesson that still echoes today. When peace is built on imbalance, instability waits beneath the surface. The guns of 1918 fell silent, but the conflict they created did not. It returned, stronger, faster, and far more destructive.